There are wars that do not begin with a single gunshot. They can take shape over decades through military alliances, territorial expansion, political crises, energy interests, and the security concerns of major powers. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine can also be viewed in this way to understand why two countries that share such a large part of their history eventually became involved in a devastating confrontation. We need to go back in time to the Cold War, when Europe was divided into two opposing military blocs. This video presents the developments and arguments contained in the original material, with particular attention to how Russia has viewed its own security concerns. It is not intended to promote or justify either side, but rather to connect the events together so viewers can gain another perspective when studying the conflict. 1. Where did NATO come from? After World War II, Europe entered a new period of tension. On one side stood the United States and its Western allies. On the other was the Soviet Union and the countries of the Socialist Bloc. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established. One of its major objectives was to strengthen collective defense against security threats that Western countries at the time associated with the Soviet Union and the spread of communism in Europe. In response, the socialist countries established the Warsaw Pact in 1955. From that point on, Europe was divided between two opposing military systems, NATO in the West, the Warsaw Pact in the East. Both sides built up their military forces and strategic weapons while engaging in an arms race. This confrontation became one of the defining characteristics of the Cold War, lasting from the late 1940s until the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in 1991, one of those two blocs disappeared. On July 1, 1991, the Warsaw Pact officially came to an end. The Soviet Union collapsed only a few months later. It should have been the beginning of a new era of security in Europe, but the story took a different direction. NATO did not dissolve. Instead, the alliance continued to exist and gradually expanded, and that process became one of the issues that increasingly concerned Moscow. 2. NATO. After the Cold War, one of the events frequently mentioned when analyzing relations between Russia and NATO is the Kosovo War in 1999. From March 24 to June 10, 1999, NATO carried out an air campaign against Yugoslavia. The background was extremely complicated. Yugoslavia had been undergoing a long process of disintegration since the early 1990s. Its constituent republics declared independence one after another, leading to a series of bloody conflicts. By the final stage of this process, what remained of Yugoslavia consisted mainly of Serbia and Montenegro. NATO argued that military intervention was necessary to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Kosovo. However, the campaign also triggered intense debate over the legality of using military force without an explicit authorization from the United Nations Security Council. The UN Secretary-General at the time, Kofi Annan, acknowledged that the use of force could sometimes be considered in the pursuit of peace. But he also criticized NATO for acting unilaterally. The air campaign caused civilian casualties and destroyed infrastructure, industrial facilities, transportation networks, and military targets for many Western countries. It was an intervention intended to prevent a humanitarian disaster, but Moscow viewed the event very differently. Russia saw it as evidence that NATO was no longer simply a defensive alliance limited to the Cold War era. From Russia's perspective, a US-led military organization had demonstrated its willingness to use force outside the territories of its members. That made the future role of NATO a particularly important question for Moscow. 3. Why was Russia concerned about NATO expansion? After the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO faced a historic choice. The alliance could reduce its role, or it could continue expanding. In reality, NATO chose the second option. Eastern European countries that had once been within the Soviet sphere of influence increasingly sought NATO membership. From the perspective of many Eastern European countries, joining NATO was a way to strengthen their security and protect themselves against possible instability in the future. Moscow, however, viewed the situation differently. For Russia, every new NATO member moving closer to its borders meant that Russia's strategic space was becoming smaller. The accession of the Baltic states was particularly concerning to Moscow. Russia had not yet fully recovered from the economic, political, and military shock of the 1990s. Under those circumstances, the continued expansion of a military alliance that had once been created in opposition to the Soviet Union, especially toward Russian territory, created a sense of encirclement. A major power is unlikely to feel secure when a military system it considers a potential rival is positioned directly along its borders. That is the security logic Moscow has often used to explain its policies. *4. Missile defense systems and the Red Line. Another issue that concerned Russia was the US and NATO missile defense system in Europe. NATO explained that these systems were intended to counter potential missile threats from countries such as Iran. Moscow, however, was not entirely convinced by that explanation. Russia feared that military facilities and missile systems deployed in Eastern Europe could alter the strategic balance in international politics. The term red line is often used to describe a limit that, if crossed by an opponent, could trigger a strong response. For Russia, NATO's movement closer to its borders and the possibility of Ukraine joining the alliance increasingly came to be viewed as one such red line. This is an important point for understanding Moscow's perspective on the crisis. However, that does not mean that every Russian argument has been accepted internationally. Many NATO countries argue that sovereign states have the right to determine their own foreign policies and choose their own security alliances. As a result, two principles have come into direct conflict. One side emphasizes the right of individual nations to choose their own path. The other emphasizes the strategic security needs of major powers, and Ukraine lies directly between these two approaches. 5. One lesser known detail. Russia once wanted to join NATO. Interestingly, relations between Russia and NATO have not always been confrontational. Historically, Moscow repeatedly expressed a desire to improve relations with the West and even raised the possibility of joining NATO during the Soviet era. In 1954, Moscow proposed the creation of a collective security system in Europe. Later, the Soviet Foreign Ministry also raised the possibility of joining NATO. The West rejected the proposal. The reason given was the fundamental difference between the Soviet political system and NATO's political principles and objectives. Years later, under President Boris Yeltsin, Russia again expressed an interest in becoming a NATO member in the future, but that never happened. Why? Part of the answer lies in the fact that Russia did not simply want to become an ordinary European country. Moscow still wanted to maintain the status of a major power with influence. Part of a military alliance centered around the United States. It would have to accept various principles and mechanisms involving military transparency and information sharing that Moscow was unwilling to embrace. Russia also maintained its own security structure. The Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, established in 1960. Moscow was not simply seeking security for itself. It also wanted to maintain a certain sphere of influence in the surrounding region. *6. Why is the sea so important to Russia? To understand Moscow's policies, geography cannot be ignored. Russia possesses an enormous territory, but it also faces a particular problem. Many of its important ports are affected by freezing conditions during the winter. That makes ice-free ports strategically valuable. Consider the Baltic region. Russia's Maritime routes in this area are connected to straits located near NATO countries if a military confrontation occurred. Moscow would always have to consider the possibility that its trade routes could be restricted or disrupted. Farther east lies Vladivostok. The port is strategically important to Russia in the Pacific. But its maritime routes also exist within a complicated geopolitical environment. Where Japan is a major U.S. ally, Russia and Japan also have a territorial dispute involving the Kuril Islands. This makes Moscow's maritime security calculations even more complicated, and then we come to Crimea. 7. Crimea and Sevastopol, a strategic key in the Black Sea. Crimea occupies a unique position on the map. The peninsula lies in the northern part of the Black Sea and is home to the port city of Sevastopol for Russia. Sevastopol has long had major military and maritime importance. From there, Russia can maintain a naval presence in the Black Sea and establish a strategic connection toward the Mediterranean that is with respect to naval power, trade, energy, and Russia's ability to deploy forces. Looking at the bigger picture, the oceans cover most of the Earth's surface and play a crucial role in global trade. Maritime routes carry energy, raw materials, and goods between continents. Throughout history, major powers that controlled important sea routes often enjoyed enormous economic and military advantages. That is why protecting maritime territory has always been a priority for countries seeking great power status. Russia is no exception. 8. Ukraine, a country between two worlds. Ukraine occupies a unique position. It is a large country located between Russia and the rest of Europe. Historically, Ukraine and Russia share deep connections in terms of culture, ethnicity, religion, and politics. Both were also part of the Soviet Union, but after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine became an independent state and began developing its own direction. The problem was that Ukrainian society contained major regional differences. In the West, support for closer relations with Europe and the West was stronger. Meanwhile, in some eastern and southern regions, historical, economic, and cultural ties with Russia remained significant. These differences created intense debates about the country's future. Should Ukraine move closer to the European Union and NATO, or should it maintain close relations with Russia? This was not simply a question of economics. It was also a question of identity, security, and geopolitics. 9. Euromaidan and the turning point of 2014. In November 2013, large-scale protests began in Ukraine. The Euromaidan movement was initially connected to the country's relationship with the European Union. Protesters wanted Ukraine to move closer to Europe, but the situation quickly became more tense. The government and opposition failed to reach an agreement by early 2014. The political crisis had escalated. President Viktor Yanukovych left Ukraine. From the Western perspective, this was the result of a protest movement against the government. Moscow, however, viewed the events differently. Russia argued that Western-oriented forces had played an important role in the change of government in Ukraine. Against this background, Crimea became the focal point. Russia quickly deployed forces and took control of the peninsula. On March 18, 2014, Russia announced the annexation of Crimea. Many countries and international organizations did not recognize the annexation. From that point onward, relations between Russia and the West entered a new period of tension. 10. Donetsk, Luhansk, and the prolonged war. The crisis did not end with Crimea. In eastern Ukraine, fighting continued between the government in Kyiv and Russia-backed separatist forces. Donetsk and Luhansk became major flashpoints. The Minsk agreements were introduced in an attempt to create a political solution, but the fighting did not completely stop. The parties continued accusing each other of violating the agreements. Meanwhile, the United States and Western countries increasingly expanded their support for Ukraine. Russia viewed the supply of weapons and military training to Ukraine as evidence that Ukraine was moving closer and closer to NATO. The tension therefore continued to build. By the end of 2021, Russia presented security proposals to the United States and NATO. Moscow wanted guarantees aimed at limiting further NATO expansion and restricting certain military activities near Russian territory. Washington and NATO did not accept those demands in the way Moscow had hoped, and then the historic turning point arrived. 11. February 24, 2022. On February 21, 2022, President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia recognized the separatist entities in Donetsk and Luhansk. 3 days later, on February 24, Russia launched a large-scale military operation across Ukraine. Moscow stated that the objectives of the operation were the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. During the initial phase, Russian forces advanced from multiple directions, including toward Kyiv. From Moscow's perspective, the operation was intended to reshape the region's security environment and prevent Ukraine from becoming part of the Western military system. For Ukraine and most Western countries, however, it was an invasion. Two completely different interpretations emerged, and that fundamental difference made the conflict even harder to resolve. 12. Kaliningrad, a small territory with major strategic importance besides Ukraine and Crimea. There is another location that frequently appears in discussions of Russia's strategy in Europe, Kaliningrad. It is a Russian territory separated from the country's main landmass before World War II. The region belonged to Germany and was known as Königsberg after World War II. Kaliningrad came under Soviet control. Today, its location has enormous military significance. It lies between Poland and Lithuania, both NATO members. From Kaliningrad, Russia can maintain military capabilities in the Baltic region and exert strategic pressure on northeastern Europe. For Moscow, it is an important strategic asset. For the Baltic states, however, Russia's military presence in Kaliningrad is a serious security concern. The same geographical location is viewed in completely different ways by opposing sides. 13. Energy, Russia's Achilles heel. If the military dimension is one part of the story, energy is another. Russia is one of the world's major holders of oil and natural gas resources. Its economy and government budget have depended significantly on revenues from oil and gas during various periods. This has provided enormous strength, but it has also created a vulnerability. The history of the Soviet Union demonstrated this. During the 1980s, global oil prices fell sharply after Saudi Arabia increased production. Oil revenues declined dramatically. At the same time, the Soviet economy was already facing serious structural problems. Not long afterward, the Soviet Union collapsed. That experience helped make energy a strategic issue for Moscow. 14. Oil, gas, and the power of modern Russia entering the 21st century. Oil and gas continued to play an important role in the Russian economy. Energy revenues allowed Moscow to increase government spending, strengthen foreign currency reserves, and invest in its military. This also explains why global oil prices have a major impact on Russia's ability to withstand sanctions. When oil prices are high, Russia receives more revenue. When oil prices collapse, pressure on the government budget increases. That is why energy is not simply a commodity. It is also a geopolitical tool. 15. Nord Stream and the energy war. One of the most controversial projects was the Nord Stream pipeline system connecting Russia and Germany. The pipeline runs beneath the Baltic Sea and was designed to transport natural gas directly from Russia to Germany. From an economic perspective, the project was expected to provide Europe with a stable gas supply while reducing dependence on traditional transit routes through Ukraine. Germany would gain another source of natural gas. Russia would gain a direct export route. But the United States and Ukraine viewed the project differently. Washington feared that Europe, particularly Germany, would become excessively dependent on Moscow for energy. Ukraine was also concerned about losing its role as a gas transit country and losing an important source of revenue. Therefore, Nord Stream was more than just a pipeline. It became a symbol of the broader struggle for influence among Russia, the United States, Germany, and Ukraine. 16. Trump, Biden, and changing U.S. policy during Donald Trump's presidency. Washington put strong pressure on energy projects involving Russia. The United States argued that projects such as Nord Stream would make Europe excessively dependent on Moscow, Germany. However, had its own economic interests. This was one of the reasons significant disagreements emerged between the United States and Germany. After Joe Biden took office in late 2020, Washington's policy toward Russia continued moving in a tougher direction. Relations between the two countries deteriorated further. Tensions surrounding Ukraine intensified. When the war began, global energy prices surged. This created a paradox. Russia faced extensive sanctions, but at the same time, revenue from energy exports could be supported by periods of sharply higher oil and gas prices. Foreign currency reserves and energy revenues gave Moscow greater resilience. 17. Why did the West impose sanctions on Russia? After the war began, the United States and its allies quickly introduced a wide range of sanctions. The objective was to pressure Russia's economy, restrict the financial resources available for the war, and reduce Moscow's access to advanced technology. But these measures also produced unintended consequences. Europe faced an energy crisis. Natural gas and electricity prices increased. Inflation became a major problem. Countries that had previously depended heavily on Russian gas had to search for alternative suppliers. The United States was able to increase liquefied natural gas exports to Europe. This changed the global energy market. The war in Ukraine was therefore no longer simply a conflict between two countries. It had become a much broader confrontation between Russia and the West. 18. But what are the deeper causes? This may be the most difficult question. Can one single cause explain the conflict? Probably not. The conflict emerged from multiple layers of interconnected issues. One layer is history. Another is geography. Another is military security. Another involves Ukraine's domestic politics. Then there are relations between Russia and the United States, NATO, expansion. Crimea, NLSK and LUKNSK. Energy. Sanctions, and the strategic calculations of major powers. Each side has its own explanation. Russia emphasizes the threat of NATO moving closer to its borders. Ukraine emphasizes its sovereignty and its right to choose its own alliances. The United States and NATO argue that every country has the right to determine its own security path. Most Western countries view Russia's military action as a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Moscow, meanwhile, argues that it is responding to an increasingly unfavorable security environment. If we look at the war from only one side, we can easily overlook the other pieces of the puzzle. 19. What is being lost? In all the debates about geopolitics, military power, oil, and NATO, one thing is easy to forget. People behind strategic maps are cities that have been destroyed, families forced to leave their homes, soldiers sent to the battlefield. Civilians living in fear. Young people growing up hearing air raid sirens and explosions. A war can be analyzed through numbers. But its consequences are never just numbers. They can continue for decades. After the fighting ends. A changing world. The war between Russia and Ukraine also shows that the international order is entering a period of profound change. For decades after the Cold War, the United States played the central role in Europe's security system, but Russia wants to reassert its influence. China is also becoming increasingly influential. European countries are paying greater attention to energy and defense. Independence. Other nations are also reconsidering the balance between economic interests and national security. The world may therefore be moving from a relatively unipolar structure toward an environment of competition among multiple centers of power, but a multipolar world does not automatically mean a peaceful world if major powers cannot find mechanisms to balance their interests. Competition can lead to new crises. 1. The lesson to reflect on. Looking back at the entire chain of events, it becomes clear that the Russia-Ukraine conflict did not emerge overnight. It developed over many years, from the end of the Cold War, from the collapse of the Soviet Union, from NATO's expansion, from the wars in the Balkans. From political upheaval in Ukraine. From Crimea, from Donetsk and Luhansk. From disputes over security. From energy. And ultimately from the decisions made by political leaders during moments of crisis. History is rarely black and white. The same event can be interpreted completely differently depending on where the observer stands. The important thing is to distinguish between understanding a cause and understanding why a country makes a particular decision does not mean agreeing with that decision. Likewise, opposing military action does not mean that we should retreat early. At the whole picture, can we understand why a regional crisis has the potential to affect the global economy and international security. Perhaps the most important lesson of this conflict is this: in international politics, what one country considers its security can sometimes become a threat in the eyes of another country without mechanisms for dialogue and de-escalation. A cycle of suspicion can continue to grow, and ultimately, the price is not paid only by governments, it is paid by ordinary people. The war has already caused enormous human, economic, and infrastructural losses. The hope that anyone can share is that one day the parties will find a path toward peace, a peace strong enough to allow the people of Ukraine to return to normal life. A peace stable enough that the people of Russia no longer have to live under a constant sense of threat, and a European security structure in which the interests of different countries can be addressed through dialogue rather than war, because in geopolitical maps, there may be nothing more than borders, but to ordinary people, those borders represent a homeland. They represent family. They represent life. Thank you for watching. If you found this video useful and want to continue exploring the history, economics, and geopolitics behind the events shaping our world, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next video.